Some people spend their entire lives studying history, only to discover the truth from the woman refilling their water glasses. Rain slid slowly down the marble windows of the New York Antiquities Museum, turning the city lights outside into blurred rivers of gold. Inside, everything glowed. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in black tuxedos and silk gowns. Champagne glasses clinked softly. Expensive heels echoed across polished stone floors. Somewhere near the orchestra balcony, a violinist played low classical notes that floated through the room like smoke. The annual Elias Foundation Gala had always attracted the most powerful names in America: billionaires, professors, politicians, historians. Tonight was no different. At exactly 8:17 p.m., Nathaniel Graves stepped onto the museum's grand staircase, and the entire room shifted around him like gravity had changed direction. Tall, sharp jaw, silver-threaded dark hair, a navy brioni tuxedo tailored so perfectly it looked carved onto him. Nathaniel wasn't simply rich. He was the kind of man newspapers called institutional. The kind of man who funded universities with one signature and moved stock markets with a sentence. Cameras flashed as he greeted senators and museum trustees with calm precision. Every smile measured, every handshake controlled. Nathaniel Graves, someone whispered near the wine table. 42 years old and worth almost $12 billion, and still somehow colder than winter. The women laughed quietly. Nathaniel barely noticed them. His attention remained fixed on the stage being prepared beneath the massive Roman exhibit at the center of the hall. Behind him, assistants moved quickly with tablets and schedules. Everything tonight revolved around one artifact, a framed Latin manuscript attributed to Emperor Elias himself. Historians called it priceless. The quote inside had become famous over the last 70 years, repeated in business schools and political speeches across the world. Power belongs to those who rewrite history. Nathaniel loved the line. He had built an empire believing it. Across the ballroom, Clara Hale carried a silver tray between tables without making a sound. 28 years old, blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Simple black waitress uniform. No jewelry except a thin silver watch that looked older than she was. Nobody really saw her. They saw the tray, the white gloves, the quiet posture. Another invisible worker moving through rich people's conversations. But Clara noticed everything. The trembling hand of the senator holding his third bourbon. The museum director nervously adjusting his cufflinks every 30 seconds. The historian near the sculpture wing mispronouncing a Greek philosopher's name while pretending expertise. She noticed all of it. And then her eyes found the manuscript. She slowed, just slightly. Rain tapped softly against the glass ceiling above her as she stared at the framed quote surrounded by gold lighting. Her expression changed for less than a second. Not surprise, not admiration. Something quieter, something heavier. "Miss," a guest snapped impatiently. Clara blinked and immediately stepped forward, offering champagne with a soft professional smile. "Of course, sir." Her voice was calm, warm, forgettable. Exactly the way wealthy people preferred service workers to sound. Nathaniel climbed onto the presentation stage while cameras turned toward him. The orchestra faded into silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "thank you for joining us tonight in support of historical preservation and academic research." His voice carried easily through the ballroom, confident without effort. "History," he continued, "is not simply memory. It is power. And no civilization understood that better than Rome." Soft applause followed. Clara moved behind the back row, quietly replacing empty glasses while listening. Nathaniel gestured toward the illuminated manuscript. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Emperor Elias wrote a phrase that still shapes modern leadership today. He smiled slightly. "Power belongs to those who rewrite history." More applause. Several historians nodded proudly. One elderly professor even stood briefly in admiration. Nathaniel continued speaking about legacy, influence, and civilization. But Clara no longer heard the words clearly. Her eyes remained fixed on the manuscript itself, specifically one line near the bottom. Her fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray. The violinist resumed softly in the background. A waiter brushed past her carrying sparkling water. Nobody noticed the tiny shift in Clara's breathing. Nobody noticed the way her gaze narrowed at a single Latin character near the center of the document. And nobody noticed that while the entire ballroom admired the quote, the waitress looked almost disturbed by it. Nathaniel stepped down from the stage to thunderous applause. Guests rushed forward immediately, eager for photos and conversations. The museum director laughed too loudly beside him. Historians praised the artifact. Investors complimented Nathaniel's speech. Everywhere around him, admiration moved like perfume through the room. Clara quietly approached the display wall holding the manuscript. She stopped 3 feet away. Rainwater shimmered down the glass ceiling above her. The ancient text glowed beneath museum lights. For a moment, she simply stared at it in silence. Then very softly, almost like speaking to herself, she whispered, "That isn't what he wrote." Behind her, a deep voice answered immediately. "Excuse me." Clara turned slowly. Nathaniel Graves stood there holding a crystal whiskey glass, watching her with calm curiosity. The noise of the gala blurred into distant static around them. Clara's face remained perfectly composed. "Nothing, sir," she said gently. But Nathaniel didn't move. His eyes drifted from her face to the manuscript, then back again. And for the first time that evening, the billionaire looked genuinely interested. The orchestra continued playing softly somewhere behind them, but neither Clara nor Nathaniel seemed to hear it anymore. Rain shimmered above the museum's glass ceiling while wealthy guests drifted through the ballroom, carrying crystal glasses and expensive opinions. Nathaniel studied the waitress carefully. Most people avoided direct eye contact with him. Clara did not. She simply stood there holding her silver tray with both hands, calm as winter water. "You said the quote was wrong," Nathaniel said quietly. Clara lowered her eyes toward the manuscript again. "I said that is not what he wrote." Nathaniel gave a faint smile. That is a dangerous distinction to make in a room full of historians. Truth usually is. The answer landed harder than he expected. Behind them, 2 professors approached the display case while discussing Roman military reforms. Neither noticed Clara. Nathaniel did not take his eyes off her. "You read Latin?" he asked. "Enough. Enough to challenge 70 years of academic consensus?" Clara's fingers adjusted slightly against the tray. "I did not challenge anything, sir." "You implied the translation was false." "No," her voice remained gentle. "I implied the interpretation was convenient." Nathaniel blinked once. That answer alone sounded more educated than half the people currently attending his gala. Before he could speak again, a museum coordinator rushed toward Clara. "Table 12 needs champagne refills immediately." Clara nodded politely. "Of course." She turned to leave, but Nathaniel stopped her with a single sentence. "What should the quote say?" Clara paused, only for a moment. Then she answered without facing him. "Power belongs to those who preserve history, not rewrite it." Nathaniel felt something strange move through his chest. Not shock exactly. Recognition. As though some invisible thread in the room had suddenly tightened. "That changes the entire meaning," he said. Clara finally turned back toward him. "Yes," she replied softly. "It does." Then she walked away into the crowd before he could ask another question. Nathaniel remained standing beside the manuscript while conversations swirled around him. Preserve history, not rewrite it. The sentence repeated in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Nearby, Professor Leonard Ashcroft adjusted his glasses while greeting museum donors. 73 years old. Harvard historian. Considered one of the leading authorities on late Roman philosophy. Nathaniel motioned him over. "Professor." "Nathaniel." The older man smiled warmly. "Magnificent evening." Nathaniel glanced toward the manuscript. "Tell me something honestly. How certain are historians about the Elias translation?" Ashcroft laughed lightly. "As certain as historians can ever be about dead emperors." "Meaning?" "Meaning we argue about everything." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Has anyone ever disputed the wording?" Ashcroft frowned slightly. "Not seriously in decades." "What?" Nathaniel looked across the ballroom toward Clara as she quietly refilled champagne near the orchestra stage. "No reason." But the professor followed his gaze. His expression shifted almost immediately. "The waitress?" Nathaniel did not answer. Ashcroft gave a faint dismissive chuckle. "Nathaniel, I assure you the manuscript has been authenticated repeatedly." "That is not what I asked." The professor's smile faded slightly. "Academic translation always involves nuance." Nathaniel stared at the quote again. "Power belongs to those who rewrite history." Suddenly the words sounded heavier than before. Sharper. More political. More modern. Almost too modern. Across the ballroom, Clara carried another tray through a cluster of investors discussing oil futures and campaign donations. She moved quietly between them, unnoticed again. But now Nathaniel kept watching her. And once he started, he could not stop. It was not beauty that held his attention. New York was full of beautiful women. It was composure. Clara moved through wealth without reacting to it. No nervousness, no admiration, no resentment, just stillness. Like someone walking through a museum after closing hours. She paused near a marble pillar where rainwater reflected softly across the floor. For a second, Nathaniel noticed her studying another artifact inscription beneath a Greek sculpture. Her eyes moved carefully across the ancient text almost instinctively. Not pretending. Reading. Actually reading it. Impossible, Ashcroft muttered quietly beside him. Nathaniel looked back. What is? Most graduate students cannot read early imperial inscriptions without reference material. The professor adjusted his glasses again. You think she can? Nathaniel asked. Ashcroft hesitated. I think she recognized the syntax pattern. Nathaniel gave a small smile. That sounded dangerously close to respect. Curiosity, Ashcroft corrected quickly. Not respect. But Nathaniel noticed the uncertainty in the old man's face. At exactly 9:02 p.m., the museum director tapped a spoon gently against his glass. The room slowly quieted. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced proudly, Professor Ashcroft has graciously agreed to give us a short presentation on the Elias manuscript before tonight's auction. Applause filled the ballroom. Ashcroft straightened his tie and approached the small stage beside the display case. Clara froze for the smallest fraction of a second while passing near the back tables. Nathaniel saw it immediately. The professor began confidently. For nearly 70 years, this quote has represented the philosophical foundation of Roman political legacy. Large screens behind him displayed the famous line in Latin. More applause followed. Clara slowly lowered her tray onto a nearby serving table. Her expression remained unreadable. Ashcroft continued speaking about empire, historical influence, and textual preservation. But Nathaniel barely listened anymore. His attention stayed fixed on Clara standing near the edge of the ballroom beneath the dim gold lights. She looked uncomfortable now, not intimidated, troubled, as though she were watching someone build a cathedral on top of a crack no one else could see. The professor smiled proudly toward the audience. And perhaps no sentence better captures the nature of power itself than this timeless declaration from Emperor Elias. He turned dramatically toward the screen. Power belongs to those who rewrite history. Silence followed for one perfect second before applause exploded through the room again. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Just once. Then somewhere inside the crowd, a glass shattered against the marble floor. The sound of shattered glass cut through the ballroom like a crack through ice. Conversation stopped instantly. Violin music collapsed into silence. Hundreds of heads turned toward the far side of the museum floor, where red wine spread slowly across white marble beneath a broken crystal glass. A young waiter stood frozen in horror beside the mess. I am so sorry, he whispered shakily. I slipped. The museum director exhaled sharply in annoyance while nearby guests stepped backward to protect expensive shoes and evening gowns. Clean it immediately, someone muttered. But Professor Ashcroft no longer looked irritated. He looked distracted, because while the room focused on the broken glass, Clara Hale had quietly spoken 3 words beneath her breath. That is backwards. Nathaniel heard her clearly. So did the professor standing on stage. Ashcroft slowly turned toward her. The ballroom remained suspended in uncomfortable silence while staff hurried to clean the floor. Clara immediately lowered her eyes as though regretting the sentence the moment it escaped. But it was too late. Nathaniel stepped forward slightly. Backwards, he asked. Clara did not answer immediately. Around them, guests pretended not to listen while absolutely listening. The professor adjusted his glasses. Miss Hale, Clara replied softly. Clara Hale, you believe the translation is incorrect? Ashcroft asked carefully. Clara hesitated. Rain rolled gently across the glass ceiling above them. Somewhere outside, distant thunder moved through Manhattan. Not incorrect, she said at last. Incomplete. Nathaniel folded one hand around his whiskey glass. Explain. Every instinct in Clara's posture suggested she wanted to disappear. Not from fear. From caution. The kind learned by people who spent years realizing intelligence made others uncomfortable. The phrase was translated in 1948 from a damaged reconstruction, she said quietly. The lower section of the manuscript had already deteriorated by then. Ashcroft frowned slightly. That is common knowledge. Clara nodded once. Yes, sir. Then what exactly are you implying? Clara glanced briefly toward the illuminated screen behind him. The final verb was interpreted politically because the restoration team believed Elias was discussing imperial control. He was discussing imperial control, one historian interrupted from the audience. Several guests nodded immediately. Clara remained calm. No, she said softly. He was discussing memory. The room became still again. Nathaniel watched her carefully now, not as a waitress, as a puzzle. Ashcroft stepped down from the stage slowly. Young woman, he said, almost kindly. The translation has been reviewed by generations of scholars. Clara gave a faint smile that somehow carried sadness instead of arrogance. I know. Then perhaps you should trust the scholars. Perhaps they should trust the grammar. A few nervous laughs escaped the crowd. One investor whispered, "This is getting interesting." Ashcroft's expression hardened slightly. And where exactly did you study Latin syntax, Miss Hale? Clara looked toward the manuscript again before answering. At home. Soft chuckles spread through several nearby guests now. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. The subtle condescension. The assumption that intelligence without credentials must be performance. Clara heard it too, but she did not react. She simply stood there beneath the gold museum lights with perfect stillness. Nathaniel found himself strangely irritated by the laughter. Ashcroft crossed his arms. Very well. Since you seem confident, tell us what the phrase actually means. Clara looked almost uncomfortable being asked publicly. It is not important. You made it important, another historian snapped. Nathaniel finally spoke again. Let her answer. Silence followed immediately. Because when Nathaniel Graves spoke, rooms obeyed. Clara inhaled slowly. Then she stepped toward the manuscript display for the first time. The movement alone shifted the atmosphere. Waitresses did not approach artifacts worth $40 million. But nobody stopped her. Not even security. The museum lights reflected softly against the glass case, while Clara studied the Latin inscription up close. Her eyes moved carefully across each line. Nathaniel noticed something unsettling then. She was not searching for meaning. She already knew it. The phrase was mistranslated because of one assumption, Clara said quietly. The Restoration Committee treated the final word as active political language instead of ceremonial archival language. Ashcroft frowned deeper. That makes no sense. Clara pointed gently toward a faded section near the lower corner. Because they reconstructed the final symbol incorrectly. The professor stepped closer immediately. Several historians followed him now. Clara continued calmly. That character is not an imperial marker. She traced the air carefully with one gloved finger. It is funerary notation used in preservation temples after the Third Aurelian collapse. Complete silence. Nathaniel watched Ashcroft's face lose color almost imperceptibly. That notation disappeared before the 4th century. The professor whispered. Clara nodded once. Exactly. One woman near the back laughed nervously. What does any of that even mean? Clara turned toward the room. Her voice remained soft enough that people leaned closer to hear. It means the sentence was never about controlling history. She looked back at the manuscript. It was about protecting it from being erased. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their glasses anymore. The entire ballroom seemed suspended inside the sound of rain. Nathaniel felt his pulse slow strangely. Because for the first time all evening, the famous quote suddenly sounded wrong in his own memory. Aggressive. Hollow. Translate it, he said quietly. Clara hesitated again. Then she spoke in clear Latin first. The ancient words flowed from her mouth with calm precision. Not rehearsed. Not dramatic. Natural. Like music remembered from childhood. Several historians visibly stiffened. One older professor actually removed his glasses completely. Then Clara translated softly into English. Power belongs to those who preserve history from men who wish to rewrite it. Silence. Real silence this time. Heavy silence. The kind that enters a room and refuses to leave. Nathaniel slowly turned toward Professor Ashcroft. The old historian looked stunned. Not angry. Not defensive. Stunned. That cannot be possible, someone whispered. Clara stepped backward immediately as though wanting distance from her own words. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I should not have interrupted the presentation." But nobody answered her, because at that exact moment, Professor Leonard Ashcroft was staring at the manuscript with trembling hands. Professor Leonard Ashcroft looked suddenly older beneath the museum lights. His trembling fingers hovered inches from the manuscript glass, while rain rolled softly above the ceiling like distant applause from another world. Nobody in the ballroom spoke. The historians near the stage exchanged uneasy glances, searching one another's faces for reassurance that never came. Clara Hale quietly lowered her eyes. She already looked regretful, not because she thought she was wrong, because she understood exactly what happened when truth entered rooms built on reputation. Nathaniel Graves watched the silence spread through the gala like cold water. A few minutes earlier, people had been laughing over champagne and investment deals. Now nobody even reached for their drinks. "Professor," the museum director whispered nervously. Ashcroft did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the Latin inscription. "The funerary notation," he murmured slowly. "That would shift the grammatical structure entirely." One historian near the front shook his head quickly. No, the Restoration archives accounted for regional notation changes. Clara spoke carefully without lifting her voice. "They accounted for military notation changes." The historian froze. Clara continued softly. "Not preservation temple notation." Nathaniel noticed something then. She never sounded arrogant. Even while correcting experts, she spoke with restraint, almost apology, that made it harder for anyone to dismiss her. Ashcroft slowly removed his glasses and cleaned them with visibly unsteady hands. "How do you know about the preservation temples?" Clara hesitated. "My father studied late imperial archival systems." A younger historian scoffed quietly. "And where was he published?" Clara's silence answered the question before her lips did. "He was not." More silence followed. Dangerous silence. Nathaniel saw the shift happen across the room. Some guests immediately decided Clara must be wrong because she lacked credentials. Others looked terrified she might be right anyway. The museum director forced a nervous smile. "Well, academic interpretation can certainly inspire lively discussion." Nobody laughed. Ashcroft stepped closer to the display case again. "The notation," he whispered. "Dear God." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes slightly. "You see it now?" The old professor swallowed hard. Possibly. That single word changed everything. Because Leonard Ashcroft was not a man known for uncertainty. Cameras quietly began appearing now. Guests lifted phones discreetly beneath the chandelier light. The atmosphere no longer felt like a gala. It felt like history balancing on the edge of a knife. Clara seemed to sense it too. She stepped backward slightly. "I should return to work." "No," Nathaniel said immediately. Every head turned toward him. Even Clara looked surprised. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the manuscript until he stood beside her beneath the gold lights. "If there is even a chance the translation is wrong," he said calmly, "then this conversation deserves to continue." "Nathaniel," the museum director whispered carefully, "perhaps privately." "Why privately?" Nathaniel asked without looking at him. "This quote has been public for 70 years. Nobody answered. Clara stood perfectly still beside him, her silver tray resting lightly against her hip. Nathaniel suddenly became aware of how strange the image looked. One of the richest men in America standing beside a quiet waitress while historians struggled to defend their own scholarship. Rain shimmered across the glass ceiling above them. Somewhere near the orchestra balcony, a violinist lowered her instrument completely. Ashcroft inhaled deeply. "Miss Hale," he said at last, "if your interpretation is accurate, then the 1948 Reconstruction Committee misunderstood the entire ceremonial context of the manuscript." Clara nodded once. "Yes, sir." Which would mean, he stopped himself. Nathaniel finished quietly. "The quote became political because somebody translated it politically." Ashcroft looked sick hearing it spoken aloud. One historian interrupted sharply. "This is absurd. We are entertaining philological revisionism from a cater waiter." Nathaniel's eyes shifted toward the man instantly. "Calm. Cold. Waitress," he corrected softly. The historian straightened awkwardly beneath the billionaire's gaze. Clara remained silent. Nathaniel noticed that too. She never defended herself personally. Only the text. Ashcroft turned toward the large digital screen behind the stage. "Bring up the lower manuscript scan," he ordered suddenly. Technicians scrambled immediately. Within seconds, The enlarged image appeared across the massive projection wall. Gasps quietly spread through the room. The faded lower notation became visible for everyone now. Ashcroft stepped closer to the screen. "There," Clara said softly. She pointed carefully toward the damaged symbol near the final line. The reconstruction assumed an imperial directive marker. Ashcroft leaned forward. "But it curves inward," Clara nodded. "Because it is funerary notation." One elderly woman near the front covered her mouth. Another historian whispered, "Impossible." Clara finally looked directly at the screen herself. Her voice became almost distant. Preservation scribes used inward curvature after the library purges. Nathaniel studied her profile carefully then. The soft gold light, the calm expression, the strange sadness in her eyes whenever she discussed history. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Clara answered without looking at him. "Since I was 12. Nathaniel stared at her. Ashcroft turned sharply. 12. Clara finally looked down. "My father showed me the archived copies before he died." The room became still again. "Archived copies," Ashcroft repeated slowly. Clara nodded once. "The original reconstruction photographs before the restoration edits." Several historians exchanged alarmed looks instantly. Nathaniel caught it immediately. "Restoration edits?" he asked. Ashcroft looked deeply uncomfortable now. During reconstruction work, damaged manuscripts are sometimes adjusted for readability. Clara's expression tightened for the first time all evening. Not anger. Pain. "They adjusted the meaning," she said quietly. Nobody argued with her this time. Rain continued tapping gently against the museum glass while tension spread through the ballroom like smoke. Nathaniel glanced toward the famous quote projected 30 feet high across the wall. For years he had admired those words, built speeches around them, framed them inside boardrooms. And now a waitress standing beneath chandelier light had quietly cracked the entire foundation underneath them. Ashcroft slowly lowered himself into a nearby chair. His face looked pale now, exhausted. "If this is true," he whispered, "then we have spent 70 years teaching the exact opposite of what Elias intended." Clara lowered her eyes again. "Yes," she said softly. "You did." The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. It sounded like people thinking too hard. Soft whispers drifted beneath the chandeliers while museum donors stared at the manuscript as though it had physically changed in front of them. Some guests quietly checked their phones. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The quote projected across the enormous screen suddenly looked unstable now. Dangerous even. Nathaniel Graves stood motionless beside Clara Hale, his whiskey untouched in his hand. For years he had admired certainty. Tonight's certainty was dissolving in front of him beneath museum lights and falling rain. Professor Ashcroft slowly rose from his chair again, still pale. "The reconstruction archives," he said carefully, "are sealed inside the Whitmore Historical Collection downtown." Clara lowered her eyes. "I know." Ashcroft studied her face. "You have seen them?" Clara nodded once. "My father worked there before they removed him." A sharp silence followed. Nathaniel noticed several historians exchange uncomfortable looks immediately. "Removed?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated for the first time all evening. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the silver tray. He challenged the reconstruction committee publicly. One historian near the back muttered under his breath, "Oh God." Nathaniel turned sharply toward him. "You know this story?" The man immediately looked uncomfortable. "Only rumors." Ashcroft closed his eyes briefly. "Not rumors." Everyone looked toward the professor. Rain tapped softly against the glass ceiling above them while the orchestra remained silent in the shadows. Ashcroft spoke slowly now, like a man reopening something buried years ago. 26 years ago, Professor Daniel Hale published a preliminary paper claiming the Elias translation had been politically distorted during restoration. Clara remained perfectly still. Nathaniel watched her profile carefully. She had heard this story before, many times. The academic response was brutal, Ashcroft admitted quietly. Most institutions dismissed him immediately. "Why?" Nathaniel asked. Ashcroft gave a tired laugh, without humor. "Because he accused some of the most respected scholars in the country of mistranslating the most famous Roman manuscript in modern academia." Clara finally spoke softly. "He did not accuse them of mistranslating it." Ashcroft looked at her carefully. "No," he admitted. "He accused them of changing it intentionally." The room shifted uneasily again. One museum trustee immediately interrupted. That is a very serious allegation. Clara looked down at the marble floor. Yes. Nathaniel studied her more closely now. The quietness in her voice no longer sounded timid. It sounded exhausted, like someone who carried an old grief too long. What happened to him? Nathaniel asked. Clara answered after several seconds. Nobody listened. Simple words, but somehow heavier than everything else spoken that evening. The ballroom became still again. Ashcroft walked slowly toward the projection screen where the Latin text still glowed 30 feet high above them. Daniel Hale argued that the quote was transformed during post-war restoration because the original meaning conflicted with political narratives of the era. You mean propaganda? Nathaniel said quietly. Ashcroft did not answer directly, which was answer enough. Clara glanced briefly toward the manuscript. My father used to say powerful people prefer history that sounds useful. Nathaniel felt that sentence land somewhere deeper than he expected, because suddenly the famous quote sounded exactly like something ambitious men would want history to say. Rewrite history. Control history. Own history. It fit power too perfectly. Clara continued softly. But preservation was never glamorous enough for empires. One younger historian crossed his arms defensively. Even if your father questioned the translation, that does not prove conspiracy. Clara nodded gently. I know. Then why bring it up? The man challenged. Clara finally looked directly at him. Calm. Steady. Because the original reconstruction photographs disappeared 2 weeks after his paper was published. Silence. Complete silence. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes immediately. Disappeared? Ashcroft rubbed his forehead slowly. Officially, they were damaged during archive relocation. Clara's expression did not change. Only the pages connected to the final notation. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. The gala had transformed into something else entirely now. Something colder. Nathaniel glanced around the ballroom and noticed several guests quietly leaving. Not because they were bored, because uncertainty frightened people with reputations to protect. Clara stepped backward slightly. I should not have said any of this. Nathaniel turned toward her immediately. Why not? She gave a faint, sad smile. Because every time someone questions history publicly, history usually punishes them. The sentence lingered heavily between them. Ashcroft stared at her with growing disbelief now. How old were you when your father died? Clara looked toward the rain above them. 14. And he taught you all this before then? Clara nodded. Every night after dinner. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. He said dead languages only survive if somebody still loves them. Nathaniel felt something tighten quietly in his chest. He suddenly pictured a small apartment somewhere in New York. Piles of old books. A tired professor nobody respected anymore. A little girl learning ancient grammar while the rest of the world ignored both of them. Ashcroft removed his glasses again. Daniel Hale was brilliant, he admitted quietly. Even the people who attacked him knew that. Clara looked surprised hearing those words. Then why did nobody help him? Nobody answered immediately. Because everyone in the ballroom already knew the truth. Reputation. Funding. Institutions. Pride. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. Because if he was right, he looked slowly toward the massive quote glowing over the ballroom. Then generations of powerful people built speeches and careers around a lie. Clara said nothing. She simply looked at the manuscript with quiet sorrow. Nathaniel noticed something important then. She was not enjoying this. She was not humiliating anyone. She was grieving something. Ashcroft slowly approached her. Miss Hale, he said carefully. Do you still have your father's notes? Clara hesitated. Some. Would you show them to me? The entire room waited for her answer. Clara looked at the old historian for several long seconds. Then very softly, almost like speaking to herself, she said, You did not believe him when he was alive. Ashcroft lowered his eyes. And for the first time that evening, one of the most respected historians in America looked ashamed. The rain outside grew heavier after 10 o'clock. Water streamed down the enormous glass walls of the museum while Manhattan blurred into silver light beyond them. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. The laughter from earlier had disappeared. Even the waitstaff moved more carefully now, sensing the tension hanging beneath the chandeliers like invisible smoke. Clara Hale quietly picked up an empty champagne flute from a nearby table as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That unsettled Nathaniel Graves more than anything else. Most people who stunned an entire room enjoyed the attention afterward. Clara looked like she wanted to escape it. "Miss Hale," the museum director called nervously. "Perhaps you should take a short break." Clara nodded politely. "Of course." She turned toward the service hallway near the West Gallery, silver tray balanced carefully against one hip. Nathaniel watched her disappear behind the marble archway. Then, without fully understanding why, he followed. The hallway beyond the ballroom was dimmer and quieter. The sounds of the gala faded behind thick museum walls until only distant violin music remained. Clara stood alone beside a catering station beneath soft yellow lights, organizing clean glasses with calm mechanical precision. Nathaniel stopped several feet away. "You reorganize silverware when you are anxious," he observed quietly. Clara glanced up, slightly surprised. "I am not anxious." "Then why are you alphabetizing cocktail napkins?" She looked down. The napkins were, in fact, arranged perfectly by embossed lettering. A faint smile almost touched her lips before disappearing again. Occupational hazard. Nathaniel leaned lightly against the marble wall. For the first time all evening, there were no historians watching them. No cameras. No applause. Just rain. "You embarrassed some very powerful people tonight," he said. Clara continued adjusting glasses. "That was not my intention." "I know." She finally looked at him fully then. The hallway lights softened the sharpness in her expression, revealing exhaustion underneath the composure. Nathaniel noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes. The tiny crease in her gloves where fabric had been stitched twice by hand. Details he normally would never have seen before tonight. "Why did you say something?" he asked quietly. Clara stared at the counter for several seconds before answering. "Because my father spent the last years of his life being called delusional." Her voice remained calm. Too calm. "And tonight, I watched people applaud the mistake that destroyed him." Nathaniel felt the sentence settle heavily into the silence between them. Clara picked up another glass carefully. "Do you know what happens to scholars after institutions reject them?" she asked softly. Nathaniel shook his head once. "Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. People simply stop listening." Rain tapped steadily against the distant windows. Clara continued speaking almost absently now, like someone remembering something she usually kept buried. "My father used to lecture at Columbia. He had students waiting outside his office every semester." She smiled faintly. "He loved dead languages more than living people." Nathaniel listened quietly. Then the reconstruction paper happened. Her fingers paused against the glass stem. Funding disappeared first. Invitations stopped. Friends stopped calling. She inhaled slowly. After a while, people began introducing him as unstable instead of brilliant. Nathaniel looked down briefly. He knew exactly how elite institutions protected themselves. Reputation was currency, and powerful people rarely forgave embarrassment. Clara looked toward the rain-dark hallway. He spent 10 years trying to prove the notation was funerary, and nobody believed him. "No," her voice softened further. "Except me." Silence returned again. Nathaniel suddenly found himself imagining a 14-year-old girl sitting beside a tired professor, surrounded by dusty papers and old Latin dictionaries, while the academic world quietly erased him. Clara finally looked back at Nathaniel. "You should return to your guests, Mr. Graves." "Nathaniel." "Nathaniel," she corrected politely. "People are waiting for you. Not the people I want answers from." Clara blinked once at that. Nathaniel stepped slightly closer. "Did your father ever publish evidence?" "Not officially, but unofficially." Clara hesitated. That hesitation told him enough. "You still have something," he said quietly. She lowered her eyes immediately. "Some notes. Photographs. Fragments." Nathaniel studied her carefully. "And you never showed anyone?" Clara gave a tired smile. "Would you?" He did not answer immediately. Because honestly, he did not know. Clara leaned lightly against the counter now, exhaustion beginning to show beneath her composure. "People think truth changes systems," she said softly. "Usually systems change truth." Nathaniel felt an unfamiliar discomfort move through him. For years he had admired control, influence, power. But standing here beside a waitress quietly defending her dead father's dignity, power suddenly felt smaller than before. "Professor Ashcroft looked genuinely shaken," he said. Clara nodded slightly. "He should be." "You blame him." "No," she looked down again. "I think he blames himself enough already." The hallway fell silent except for rain and distant music. Then Nathaniel noticed something partially visible beneath Clara's serving tray. A folded piece of yellowed paper tucked carefully between order slips. Old paper. Fragile paper. Clara saw his eyes shift toward it and immediately covered it with one hand. Not aggressively. Instinctively. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow slightly. One of your father's notes? Clara's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I carry it with me sometimes. Why? She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because it is the only place left where somebody still calls him a scholar. Nathaniel said nothing after that. He simply watched her standing there beneath soft hallway lights, while rain slid endlessly across the museum windows. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire who controlled corporations, politicians, and markets realized something uncomfortable. The quietest person in the building might also be the strongest. By 11 o'clock, the gala had divided itself into two kinds of people. Those pretending nothing important had happened, and those unable to think about anything else. Rain continued pouring against the museum glass, while servers quietly replaced untouched drinks across the ballroom. The orchestra had resumed playing, but softer now. Hesitant. Even the music sounded uncertain. Nathaniel Graves walked back into the main gallery beside Clara Hale without speaking. Conversations immediately lowered around them. Not stopped. Lowered. The way people react when they realize history might be standing beside them carrying a silver tray. Clara seemed to notice every stare without reacting to any of them. Calm. Controlled. Invisible again if you looked quickly enough. But nobody looked quickly anymore. Near the center sculpture hall, several historians gathered around Professor Ashcroft, arguing in low, urgent voices while enlarged scans of the manuscript rotated slowly across digital screens. Latin symbols glowed gold against black backgrounds. Nathaniel noticed something unsettling then. Half the room now looked at Clara instead of the artifact, as though she had become the real exhibit. There she is, a voice muttered nearby. Clara's shoulders stiffened almost invisibly. A museum trustee named Richard Voss approached, holding a champagne glass with the confidence of a man accustomed to owning rooms through money alone. Late 60s. Expensive smile. Expensive watch. The kind of face newspapers described as distinguished even when it looked cruel. Quite the performance tonight, Voss said smoothly. Clara answered politely. I did not intend one. No. He glanced toward the historians clustered around the screens. You certainly managed to derail a $40 million exhibition rather efficiently for someone carrying cocktail napkins. Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. Clara remained calm. I only corrected the translation. Voss smiled without warmth. According to notes from a disgraced academic no serious institution recognized. Several nearby guests immediately pretended not to listen while listening carefully. Clara lowered her eyes. My father was serious enough. Was he? Voss sipped his champagne casually. From what I remember, Daniel Hale became rather obsessed near the end. Nathaniel saw it then. The smallest change in Clara's breathing. Pain, not anger. Worse. Voss continued smoothly. Brilliant men sometimes struggle when the world moves on without them. Nathaniel finally spoke. Quietly. That is enough. Voss turned slightly, surprised by the interruption. Nathaniel, surely you are not entertaining academic revisionism from catering staff. Waitress, Nathaniel corrected again. His voice remained calm, but colder now. And if the revision is accurate, then the profession failed. Not her. Silence spread instantly around them. Voss gave a short, amused laugh. You sound emotionally invested. Nathaniel's gaze never moved. I sound capable of recognizing intelligence. Clara looked at Nathaniel briefly then. Just once. Something unreadable moved through her expression before disappearing again. Voss smiled thinly. Be careful. Wealthy men have a habit of romanticizing ordinary people after dramatic evenings. Clara spoke before Nathaniel could answer. There is nothing ordinary about truth, Mr. Voss. The sentence landed softly, but several people nearby visibly reacted to it. Voss studied her now with open irritation. You really believe one forgotten notation outweighs 70 years of scholarship? Clara looked toward the glowing manuscript screens. No, she paused. I believe 70 years of scholarship should have noticed the notation. A few guests quietly looked away to hide smiles. Voss noticed too. His jaw tightened slightly. Confidence can become arrogance very quickly. Clara nodded gently. So can authority. The silence afterward felt almost electric. Nathaniel realized what was happening then. Clara was not trying to humiliate powerful people. But powerful people often humiliated themselves when confronted by someone they expected to be beneath them. Across the gallery, Professor Ashcroft suddenly called out loudly enough for the room to hear. Nathaniel. Everyone turned. The old historian stood beside the projection screen holding several printed restoration photographs, invisibly shaking hands. You need to see this. The crowd moved instantly toward the center hall. Nathaniel followed while Clara hesitated near the back. She clearly did not want more attention, but attention followed her anyway now. Ashcroft spread several enlarged photographs across a marble display table beneath the chandelier lights. These are preliminary scans from the original reconstruction archive, he said quietly. I requested emergency access from the Whitmore collection 10 minutes ago. Historians leaned forward immediately. Nathaniel studied the photographs carefully. The manuscript looked older in these images. Less polished, less reconstructed, more damaged. But one detail stood out immediately. The final notation curve. Inward, not outward. Exactly as Clara described. Ashcroft exhaled slowly. The Restoration Committee changed the notation during enhancement processing. Enhanced, Nathaniel repeated sharply. One younger historian swallowed hard. It was common after the war to clarify damaged symbols for educational display. Clara finally stepped closer to the table. You clarified the sentence into a completely different meaning. Nobody contradicted her, because now the evidence sat directly beneath museum lights for everyone to see. Voss stared at the photographs in disbelief. This cannot be intentional. Ashcroft looked exhausted. Maybe not originally. He removed his glasses slowly. But after enough speeches, enough publications, enough institutions repeating the revised translation, he looked toward the massive quote projected above the ballroom. The correction became more valuable than the truth. Complete silence followed. Nathaniel glanced toward Clara again. She stood quietly beside the display table while historians stared at her father's forgotten evidence with growing horror. No triumph. No satisfaction. Only sadness. My father used to say history becomes dangerous when powerful people start editing it for inspiration, she said softly. The room listened now. Every person in it. Because eventually, Clara continued, nobody remembers where the edits began. Rain thundered harder above the glass ceiling then, echoing softly through the museum like distant applause. And for the first time all evening, nobody in the ballroom seemed capable of looking away from the waitress anymore. Midnight approached quietly over Manhattan. Rain still washed across the glass roof of the museum, while thunder rolled far above the city like something ancient moving through the sky. Inside the grand hall, nobody cared about the auction anymore. The artifact cases stood untouched. Champagne sat forgotten on silver trays. Every conversation now revolved around one thing. Daniel Hale might have been right all along. Professor Ashcroft remained beside the projection table, studying the original reconstruction photographs with exhausted disbelief. Several historians argued softly behind him, but their voices carried less certainty now. Nathaniel Graves stood near the center of the room, watching Clara Hale carefully. She had drifted back toward the edge of the ballroom again, almost instinctively returning herself to the background. Yet somehow the entire room still revolved around her. Miss Hale, a woman's voice called gently. Clara turned. An elderly curator approached slowly through the crowd, carrying a thin leather archive folder against her chest. Margaret Whitmore, 81 years old, Director Emeritus of the Whitmore Historical Collection, one of the most respected archival authorities in the country. The room quieted almost immediately as she stopped in front of Clara. You have your father's eyes, Margaret said softly. Clara looked genuinely startled. You knew him? The older woman nodded once. Before people became afraid to. A painful silence followed. Margaret carefully opened the leather folder in her hands and removed a yellowed newspaper clipping. Nathaniel stepped closer instinctively. The article headline read, Columbia historian questions authenticity of Elias translation. Beneath it was a black and white photograph of a younger Daniel Hale standing outside a university lecture hall holding several books against his chest. He looked tired even in the picture, but his eyes looked kind. Clara stared at the photograph silently. I kept this all these years, Margaret said quietly, because I thought someday someone might ask what really happened to him. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the clipping. The room remained completely still around them. Margaret looked toward the enlarged manuscript scans glowing above the ballroom. "Your father came to my office 3 weeks before they removed him from Columbia," she said. "He begged me to preserve the original notation photographs before the Reconstruction Committee sealed them." Ashcroft slowly looked up from the projection table. "You never told anyone this." Margaret's tired eyes shifted toward him. Nobody wanted to hear it. Nathaniel noticed several historians lowering their gazes now, Ashcroft among them. Margaret continued softly. "Daniel Hale said something I never forgot." She looked toward Clara again. "He told me powerful people do not fear lies nearly as much as they fear corrections." Silence spread through the ballroom once more. Clara carefully folded the newspaper clipping with both hands, as though it might break apart if touched too quickly. Nathaniel saw moisture gather faintly in her eyes for the first time all evening. Not dramatic tears, just quiet emotion held carefully under control. Margaret reached gently into the archive folder again and removed a second document. Older, fragile, handwritten. "I believe this belongs to you now," she said softly. Clara stared at the paper instantly. Her breathing changed. "Where did you get that?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Your father mailed it to me the week before he disappeared from academia." Nathaniel glanced toward the page. Dense handwritten Latin annotations covered nearly every inch. Along the bottom, one sentence had been underlined repeatedly in dark ink. "Truth survives longer than institutions." Clara's hands slowly covered her mouth. The room stayed silent enough to hear the rain against the glass ceiling overhead. "I thought this was lost," she whispered. Margaret shook her head gently. "No, hidden." Nathaniel watched Clara carefully now. The quiet waitress who had entered the gala carrying champagne now stood beneath chandelier light, holding the last surviving notes of a disgraced historian the academic world had tried to forget. And somehow she still looked humble. That affected him more than brilliance ever could. Ashcroft slowly approached them. His face looked older now than it had hours earlier. "Miss Hale," he said carefully, "I owe your father an apology I can no longer give him." Clara looked down at the handwritten notes. He would not have wanted an apology. What would he have wanted? Ashcroft asked quietly. Clara answered after several seconds. "For people to stop pretending certainty is the same thing as truth." Nobody spoke after that, because nobody in the room could honestly argue with it anymore. Nathaniel glanced toward the massive quote still projected across the museum wall. It looked different now, smaller somehow, less powerful. Then Clara did something unexpected. She walked slowly toward the center stage beneath the enormous screen. The room instinctively parted for her. Not because she demanded attention, because she no longer needed to. Clara carefully placed her father's handwritten notes beside the enlarged Reconstruction photographs on the marble table. Side by side, the forgotten scholar and the evidence they buried with him. Cameras flashed softly throughout the ballroom now. Historians stared openly. Investors whispered. But Clara herself looked only at the notes. "My father used to tell me something every night before bed," she said quietly. Her voice echoed softly through the silent museum. "He said history is not written by the loudest people." She paused gently. "Only the people who survive long enough to correct it." Nathaniel felt the entire room absorb the sentence at once. Even the rain seemed quieter afterward. Then Professor Ashcroft slowly stepped beside Clara beneath the chandelier light and turned toward the crowd. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen." He looked at the original photographs again before continuing. "I believe we owe Professor Daniel Hale his name back." The museum felt quieter after that. Not physically quieter. The rain still struck the glass ceiling above Manhattan. The orchestra still played soft strings near the balcony. Cameras still flashed across the ballroom every few seconds. But something inside the room had changed permanently. The arrogance was gone. In its place stood something rarer. Humility. Clara Hale remained beside the marble table where her father's notes rested beneath the chandelier light. Historians moved around the documents carefully now, almost reverently, as though afraid their hands no longer deserved to touch them. Professor Ashcroft spoke quietly with several archivists while emergency calls were made to universities, collections, and restoration departments across the country. The correction had already begun spreading beyond the museum walls. Nathaniel Graves stood near the back of the hall watching everything unfold. For years he had attended galas exactly like this one. Wealthy people celebrating their own importance beneath expensive lighting. But tonight felt different. Tonight a waitress carrying a silver tray had done something billionaires and institutions could not. She made powerful people question themselves. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, guests slowly began leaving the museum. Some looked shaken, some embarrassed, some strangely inspired. Nobody left untouched. Richard Voss departed without speaking to anyone. Several historians avoided cameras entirely. Others remained near the projection screens, studying the corrected translation with exhausted fascination. Clara quietly began collecting abandoned glasses from nearby tables again. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. Even after everything, she returned to work. "You do realize nobody expects you to keep serving drinks tonight," he said softly as he approached her. Clara picked up an empty champagne flute carefully. "The staff is short-handed." Nathaniel almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "You just dismantled 70 years of academic certainty." Clara gave the faintest shrug. "And table 6 still needs clean glasses." Nathaniel stared at her for a moment before smiling for the first time all evening. A real smile this time. Unpracticed. Clara noticed it and looked briefly surprised herself. Rainwater shimmered softly beyond the glass walls behind them, while museum lights reflected gold across the marble floor. "What happens now?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Clara placed another glass onto the tray. "For me? For your father." That stopped her movement for a second. She looked toward the projection screen where the corrected translation now appeared beside Daniel Hale's name. "Not hidden anymore. Not erased anymore. Nothing changes for him," she said softly. "He is still gone." Nathaniel followed her gaze. "His reputation changes." Clara smiled sadly. "Reputations are mostly for the living." The sentence lingered between them gently. Nathaniel noticed then how tired she looked. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only exhaustion beneath her calm composure. "Have you slept at all this week?" he asked suddenly. Clara blinked. "What? You look exhausted." She almost laughed softly. "That is because I am." "Why?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Double shifts. At the museum? Here and at a diner in Brooklyn." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "You work 2 jobs?" "3, technically." She adjusted the tray lightly. "My mother's medical insurance only covers part of her treatment." Nathaniel looked at her differently after that. Not with pity, with respect. Clara noticed the change immediately. "Do not do that," she said softly. "Do what?" "Look at me like I am tragic." Nathaniel shook his head once. "I am looking at you like you are remarkable." Clara lowered her eyes immediately, as though uncomfortable hearing it. The orchestra music drifted quietly through the nearly empty ballroom now. Most of the historians remained near the manuscript displays, still arguing in hushed, astonished voices. "You could teach at any university in the country after tonight," Nathaniel said. Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe. You do not sound interested." "I spent most of my life watching institutions protect themselves instead of truth." She looked toward her father's notes again. "It is difficult to fall in love with institutions after that." Nathaniel understood more than she realized. Corporations behaved similarly. Power rarely surrendered comfort voluntarily. Clara carefully lifted the tray again. "I should finish before the cleanup crew arrives." Nathaniel reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and removed a business card. Plain white. Minimal lettering. The kind of card that opened impossible doors. "Take this," he said quietly. Clara looked at it, but did not reach immediately. "Why?" "Because tomorrow every university and journalist in America is going to look for you." "I know." "And because powerful people do not always react kindly to corrections." Clara studied him carefully now. "You really believe that?" Nathaniel gave a small, humorless smile. "I built a career around watching powerful people protect narratives." After several seconds, Clara finally accepted the card. Her fingers brushed his very briefly. "Warm. Careful. Human." "Thank you," she said softly. Nathaniel glanced toward the corrected translation glowing high above the ballroom. "For what?" Clara looked at him with calm sincerity. "For listening before it became popular." The sentence hit him harder than he expected. Because she was right. Most people only respected truth after crowds approved it first. Rain softened outside gradually. The storm over Manhattan was finally beginning to pass. Museum workers dimmed several chandelier sections as cleanup crews quietly entered the hall. The night was ending, but something else had begun. Clara picked up her tray once more and turned toward the final row of abandoned tables. Halfway there, Nathaniel called after her quietly. "Clara." She looked back. He hesitated only briefly before asking, "Why stay invisible for so long if you knew you were right?" Clara stood beneath the soft gold light for several seconds before answering. Her expression remained calm, almost peaceful now. "Because," she said gently, "people listen more carefully when they think you are nobody." Then she walked quietly through the emptying ballroom, carrying silver glasses beneath the fading chandelier light, while above her, for the first time in 70 years, the corrected words of Emperor Elias finally stood untouched by power. Power belongs to those who preserve history from men who wish to rewrite it.